Welcome to Good Sex at NYU, a podcast about sex, relationships, health, and mental health in a sex-positive space. So if you're looking for sometimes serious, sometimes funny, and always sex-positive discussions, then you're in the right place. I'm Danielle Elliman, Associate Director of Sexual and Relationship Respect Services at Counseling and Wellness Services. I use she, her pronouns.
And I am April Fellers, a nurse and sexual health educator at the Student Health Center. I also use she, her pronouns. We are two white, cisgender, heterosexual, female-identifying clinicians, one with a medical background and the other with mental health experience, who seek to create a space that is inclusive of all identities, backgrounds, and perspectives.
Today on Good Sex at NYU, I am here with my co-host, Dr. Rafael Rodriguez, who is the Vice President for Student Engagement and Dean of Students, and who our audience will remember. He is a podcast favorite. He's been on Season 2, Episode 9, Season 3, Episode 1. So you're
That's
back
right.
for more,
Yes,
but as
back for
co-host
more.
this time.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Welcome. So joining us today is Krystal McLeod, who is the Co-Executive Director and Chief Program Officer of the NYU Center on Violence and Recovery, where she leads a multidisciplinary team of practitioners, social workers, organizers, activists, artists, and survivors deeply committed to reimagining our nation's response to violence. She is a practitioner and national advocate for using restorative approaches to address the root causes of violence. Ms. McLeod holds a JD from the University of Notre Dame Law School and a BA in politics from NYU. She has been named as Forbes 30 Under 30 honorees, Dalai Lama Fellow, Truman Scholar, Compassionate Leadership Fellow, and Senior Humanity in Action Fellow. Welcome to the podcast, Krystal. We're so happy to have you here.
It's a gift to be here, Danielle, and so great to see you, Raph. I'm so excited.
Good to see you too.
Yeah.
Quite the intro, quite the bio.
Yeah. So many things
Thank
we
you
could
for that.
talk about, but
Yes.
can you just share a little bit more about your journey to the path that you've taken career-wise and what led you here?
Absolutely. So I like to say this work chose me. My family of origin, my household of origin, I got to see each and every day love, care, ease, joy, heartbreak, heartache, grief, loss, all coexist at once. And so for me, my upbringing was evidence that multiple truths can coexist all at the same time. And I saw that every day, and I knew that truth so profoundly and so deeply, like I knew my own skin. And so I really think, that set me up, or really for this lens in which I see the world and which I see this work through, in terms of restorative work, reconciliation work, the work of peace building. I'd also say that I have one of my favorite scholars and practitioners in this work. His name is John Paul Lederach, and he's a professor at the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame. He talks about when someone asked him this question of, how do I become, an expert in conflict transformation? And I think they were looking for this really technical answer. And he responded, find someone who you deeply disagree with and commit to being in conversation with them for a lifetime. For a lifetime.
Sounds like my parents.
Well, this is absolutely sounds like my parents. And that was my household of origin, was there's this really deep sense that there are no throwaways, right? I remember I come from a blended family. So it's 12 kids, 6 girls, 6 boys. And I would always be like, Mom, I can't stand this person. Get them away. I'm over it. And she would always respond in the same way of well, that's your sister, that's your brother, that's your family. And You don't have to disagree with them, but you do have to love them and care for them. And it was really annoying. Let's be clear. And there was a magic in that I think really shaped my lens and my commitment and desire to be a part of this work. So I think that's the way in which like my family of origin and my upbringing shaped me. I think there were also, these real moments in my life. I went to undergrad at NYU, and prior to coming to NYU, I experienced in my adolescence, I was in a domestic violence relationship. And what was so interesting for many different reasons was it was the first time that I saw the complexity of holding an intersectional identity, right? I was Black and a woman. And this person who had harmed me was my next door neighbor, my family friend, also a Black man. And so I wanted accountability. I wanted him to understand the impact, and I didn't want the criminal legal system involved. And so it put me in a really hard place of having needs as a survivor, really deeply wanting accountability and wanting him to get the healing he needed, right? But not knowing an option that directly aligned with what I was hoping for. And it wasn't until I was an undergrad at NYU where I'd normalized what had happened so much. And I'll never forget it. I was attending a West event. It was like Women of Excellence, Strength, and Tenacity. And they were talking about relationships and sort of all the things present in an unhealthy relationship. And I was like, yikes.
You're like, check.
check. And so much so that I brought this to my friend, and we were in the third. I was in Founders as a freshman, and we were on the third floor in the Founders hallway, and I was sharing with her my story in terms of that relationship, and she was the one after attending the West event that was like, Krystal, that wasn't okay. And set me on this pathway of healing. I ended up going to wellness, and there a lot of different in the Student Health Center, like support groups for folks who had experienced like sexual assault, survivor support groups and domestic violence. And I went, and that was really a huge moment for me, and committed me to this path of like, we make this mistake within our survivor framework that survivors are a monolith, right, when it comes to harm. And they're not. There are survivors that deeply, would desire a criminal legal system response. There are survivors like myself that don't. And so a part of my commitment to this work is how do we create a variety of options so that a survivor can choose an option that really aligns with their own healing. The other piece that's layered for me is we also have a responsibility to ensure that harm doesn't happen again, right? And so that means as much as we, when it comes to those who have caused harm, it can bring up a real salient response and reaction. We also have a commitment to ensure that their transformation happens, not just for that survivor, but for survivors, period, right? And for the community. We have a moral responsibility to the community. And so I think that's what grounds me so much in this work. And I'm so grateful, that our 17th president founded CVR, the Center on Violence and Recovery, in which I'm co-executive director, because each day I get to see the possibility of this work. So that was a long answer. But I'll give you the arc.
We can listen to more.
Yeah, I was like, I could listen to you all day. You know that already. But it shows like the roots and the foundation, and that's so needed, and it motivates, and it's where we get our passion from. So I thank you for sharing that, because I think it is important for people to know that that's where you're coming from.
Krystal, you talked about the various needs of survivors and how it's the community is not a monolith, and there are many different needs. And those of us who do this kind of work, either helping work, restorative work, or working in higher ed, who are students who might have been victimized or have been victimized, we can begin to open our mind to understanding that needs vary. There's a second piece that you shared that talked about the moral responsibility to not replicate harm or not have harm caused again. And in there, you're centering the wrongdoer, the offender. That's a bit more difficult for many to grasp their mind around. Talk a bit more about what you think that moral responsibility is.
Yeah, I think this is a brilliant, question, Raf. And because it is difficult, right? I akin it to like holding a rock with many, that's quite sharp on some sides and is heavy and has a particular shape. This idea of seeing the humanity of someone who's caused harm. What's been really interesting to me is when I initially came into this work, I had this personal story and I was able to see the humanity of the person who had caused me harm. But as a general frame, that was still quite difficult. And I think a part of it for myself was, if I see someone's humanity, does that mean that what they did is okay, right? So this sort of dichotomous view, if I honor that you're a human being, am I saying that your behavior is all right? And this beautiful RJ practitioner once shared with me a few years ago that we need to be hard on the behavior and kind when it comes to the person. I was like, wait, tell me that again? And she was like, yes, tough on the behavior and kind to the person. And so, I can call out that what you did is egregious, right? That that your that certain behaviors are not okay, and that in this community that values, for instance, nonviolence, compassion, safety, that your behavior violated those values. I can say that, and we can be direct with that, and also hold that you are a human being. One of the things that's also helped me in this work is there is a thin line, a very thin line between those who've caused harm and those who've been harmed. And the real question is, what point in time are we talking about?
That's right.
And I've sat with folks, who are serving life sentences in maximum security prisons. And the first time I did so, I'll never forget, I asked this question. Richard Rohr has this quote: pain untransformed becomes transferred. And so I asked this to the men. I said, okay, let's reframe. Trauma untransformed becomes transferred. Can you name a time when someone else's untransformed trauma impacted you and what you wish you knew? And then, share a time that your untransformed trauma impacted someone else and what you wish they knew, or what you wish you knew at the time and they knew. What was really profound was every single man in that circle shared a survivor story before the age of 12, witnessing violence that was caused to a family member, experiencing violence, and feeling powerless, right? And what that did in terms of their own view on masculinity and feeling, watching, a woman that they loved, like their mother, being harmed and not being strong enough or being brave enough or courageous enough, this is their language, not mine, to do something about it. And this is the part that makes me really sad. All of it, but, sort of like waiting, is someone gonna see me? Like, when is someone gonna step in and do something about this? And then in each of the stories, there was that commonality. And then also this moment where they realize that no one's coming to save me. This is their words, not mine. And so I no longer want to be someone who is powerless. I'm going to be someone who has power over. And this is also a part of our conditioning that we have not, we have our scarcity conditioning, that we have not learned yet how to experience power, which I believe is a human need. We all need to feel a sense of positive personal power, but without taking it from someone else, right? And so I think when I sit in a process or with someone and I ground in, oh, there's a survivor story there possibly. There's a harm story there possibly. And you're actually acting out of that person who's never been seen, heard, or understood or deeply known, right? It allows me to really hold the possibility that, of course, this person can transform. And also, how can I hold that person harmed in you so that you can take accountability for the harm you've caused to someone else?
That's transformational.
Yeah.
The love of grace. Yeah.
I'm sitting with a lot of that, just thinking about like survivors that I work with. I also do some workshops where I get folks who are respondents in a case and sort of sitting with, struggling with my dual role of working predominantly with people who experience harm, but also sitting in some of these workshops with people who cause harm. And it's a workshop space, so it can be like not as, safe, and really sort of thinking about what they're going through and not being able to, just reach them, in that space, right? To be able to, they're in there, they're very angry, they're very defensive. I'm required to do this. And so I'm like, I want to see that humanity. I want you to be here and just sort of think, how can I re-examine some things? How can I understand that I have an impact and I've had an impact on someone, right? So like just all that you said was just really well put, and I'm going to take from that. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And, it's interesting. I have so many thoughts on what you just shared because I have a lot of folks in this work that are defense attorneys. And that's really shifted also my mindset on terms of what I'd say our reliance on punishment as a way to get public safety, right? And I'll never forget this one conversation with a defense attorney. Her name is Tristan Edwards, and is a dear friend. And she was sharing, Krystal, let's really talk about what happens, right? When someone, the misconception we have about punishment, at least as it pertains to the criminal legal system, but I would argue in other spaces, is that once someone gets punished, all they're thinking about is the person that they've caused harm to. When actually the punishment, especially in the carceral state, flips the position, right? So now you're the victim, right? That's experiencing violence on a day-to-day basis. And what you're actually thinking about is your own survival. Now let's place it to what you just shared, Danielle, in terms of, students that are experiencing punishment, et cetera, is that actually what I'm thinking about is my own survival. What do I have to do? What am I required to do? How is this taking away from class time? So I think we have to be really nuanced in our understanding of what punishment actually does. And I'm not saying that I understand, I think our reliance on punishment comes from a desire to rebalance the scales. We know intuitively that when a harm is committed, we need to do something, right? But I don't think that punishment always gets us what we think that it will. And how do we become, nuanced and mindful that the reliance on this one pathway, if for instance, if we want to ensure that public safety is happening, that this doesn't happen again, while punishment could certainly have a deterrence factor for others that may commit that harm, it doesn't produce everything that we want, right? And so I think that's also something that's been really impactful for me, is understanding like, what does punishment actually do, and what do we actually want, and how do we create responses that get us all of the things that we want when we're talking about accountability work.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, because I think you and I have often talked about this. You really pushed me to think about how we can imagine restorative practices and justice through this lens, which is a learning growth for me. And you and I have talked about that a lot. And you really do a great job of helping articulate what I can so easily see outside of this context in our work with our students, and what's a very real life scenario that has consequences that are generational. And they continue to move on. And you call us to think about how we can do this in a way that's going to really inspire change in one of the most difficult circumstances and situations. So I always appreciate you pushing me to be a much more open thinker on this topic.
Well, and I think that one of the things that I'm also thinking about is ways in which we are so close to potentially, and I mean, we do cause harm ourselves, right? And to constantly be keeping that in mind, that, we might have all experienced some levels of, harm ourselves, but like we've also caused harm, and to keep that in mind, right? And so just sort of shifting things a little bit, I'm wondering, because I think sometimes people want to take the power back if they've experienced harm. And so they might have, systems that they don't want to engage in or do, whatever, like feels like you were saying, like everyone has their own individual journey. I think sometimes we also try to, through social media or through canceling people. So I'm wondering if you can share some thoughts on like this cancel culture and what that looks like. Any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. So like my new a phrase of the year, and it's actually going to be phrase of my lifetime, is I'm not canceling anyone. And I've come to this very slowly and gradually and thoughtfully. And now there's resolve in this conclusion. And precisely because we can't create the world that we want by throwing out the people we don't. And I know that because I've tried. And I think we have. And what ends up happening is we create the same bifurcation that we're frustrated about. So we have the world, you have your own world of those who have the values that you want and those who don't. But you still have to interact with those who don't, right? And so, we have to really develop the muscle and the skill to be able to be in relationship with those who you don't have the same views around. One of the values that has been helping me recently is what I call loving disagreement. Every time I'm in space with someone, on why I love our conversations, right, that you're like, ooh, because it like stretches you, it challenges, and vice versa, our conversation. And similarly, Danielle, every time I'm in space with someone, I agree to deeply see and deeply hear someone. I don't agree to being in agreement with everything that they say, right? But the commitment is like, how do I commit to being open and being stretched in dialogue and knowing that there's something there in the beauty of committing to that process? And I get to walk away with my nuggets, my takeaways, my insights, and decide on the opinions that I want to hold and the opinions that I've now transformed or haven't, right? I also think, to what you shared, Danielle, trauma is an experience in essence of powerlessness, right? So many of us who have experienced trauma, and I think, sometimes we think of trauma in the big T, right? But really trauma in essence is anything that overwhelms your nervous system. So it can be anything. You feel a sense of powerlessness. And so the natural response in trying to figure out to build back safety and security is like, how do I get my power back? And so really quickly it can get to power over. I've made a joke, and I don't know if it's a good joke, so feel free. If it's not a good joke, delete it. But I was in conversation, much like Raph and I's conversation, with another restorative practitioner, and I made this joke that when people flee persecution or oppression without healing first, they build America. And
I think that's...
Is that a joke or is that deep?
I know. I was like, I don't know that that's that funny. It's a little true.
It's deep. It requires unpacking.
Yeah.
It's unpacking. Initially, it was a joke. And then the person I was in conversation with responded just like Rap just did. And I was like, oh, there's something deeper here. And what we're speaking to is the human challenge, right? Of you've experienced the pain of oppression, of persecution, of being the other. It is so likely that if you don't heal that first, you will do the same thing that frustrated and broke you to someone else. So we need to be really mindful of that. And I think a great reflection of that is cancel culture, right? It comes from a desire like to hold folks accountable, right? And to ensure that the harms that we've experienced, you've experienced, don't happen again. But oftentimes it goes from accountability to punishment, and accountability and punishment are two totally different things. Punishment, for me, I think about expendability and disposability, right? That I am now, not only am I holding you accountable, but I'm ensuring that you are no longer welcome in this community, right? I'm disconnecting you, I'm eliminating you. Where I think accountability is quite loving. It's this other tone of I care about you, I care about us, I care about what we're building, and so I share this because I believe in your potential to transform. And similar to John Paul Lederach, I'm committed to staying in this relationship for a lifetime, or for a point in time, that and believe that you're so valuable, that simply because you've made a mistake, no matter how egregious the mistake may be, that you're not the worst thing that you've ever done. I'm not going to reduce you to that. And I still want to remain in conversation with you. And that's a completely different tone. I give one of like, the calling, I call it calling in, which is the tone that I'm talking about, that comes from a place of love and care and calling you into your values, as opposed to calling out, which is the tone of elimination and punishment and expendability. The calling in reminds me of my mother. She had, and I knew growing up, like when you deeply love someone or something, because we can talk about, when we have critiques on organizations or institutions that we really love, like you want to give loving feedback to it, right? Because you want to see it transform. I make the joke that like my mom had 50,000 different things to say, ways that she would call me in. I think like 50% of them, like, okay, I didn't, okay, Mom, not really sure. But the other 50% really came from this desire and this deep belief in my own transformation. I think the last thing that I want to say on this is a concept I've been exploring called carcerality. And carcerality, it's a really common term within the criminal legal system landscape. And it is our reliance on surveillance, policing, punishment, elimination to address harm, right? And you see that a lot within our criminal legal system. What's really interesting to me is the way in which carcerality creeps into our everyday lives, right? Into what I'd say is carceral thinking, carceral logic. And because sometimes I think we forget that people build institutions, right? So our criminal legal system exists because someone thought that this is the way we need to address harm, right? This is the way we need to address people who cause harm. And so what I'm interested in is the way in which the same thinking, the desire to eliminate a perceived threat or something that triggers us, actually is quite reminiscent of carcerality. And that if we want to build relationships, organizations, teams that are rooted in care and connection, we have to be really aware of the carceral being that exists in all of us, right? And to say, oh, wow, ooh, oh, I know her. and 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 that's not who I want to be. And not from a place of shame or a place of judgment, but from a place of um, a deep desire um to really ground in the person that we want to become. So that's the last thing I would say on cancel culture. But I'm curious on what's come up for both of you.
Go ahead.
Well, I will share that cancel culture, I think it's much more complex. I love your unpacking of it can be the search for accountability for some, particularly I think those who have marginalized identities or have experienced powerlessness. And I think for others, it can be a displacement of guilt. So that if I cancel, you don't see my complicity. And I think that's where it gets a bit complex. And what I loved about what you shared was you talked about and touched on the need for healing in doing this work. We often don't center that. I think cancel culture is still important in its need, in its best forms, and its desire to acquire some kind of accountability. It's still centering the other. It's still decentering the individual's self-work and identity and healing that's necessary. And it's focusing on the dominant person, right? Or the person who has power. Can you talk a bit more about what healing looks like for you? And what does healing look like for someone who wants to begin a path of healing some of their own trauma as it relates to specifically the identities they may hold?
Raf, I can't go straight to healing. You just dropped a bar. I just wrote that down. Oh my gosh. I'm just sitting with that. The displacement of guilt. That is so real. And I think what I appreciate about that reflection is that it just, what we're talking about, like we never want a reductionist view on these really complex and nuanced realities. So I just really appreciate that additional layer that I'd never thought about before. And I think it's so real. So I really appreciate that. And I think the invitation on healing, there's so much. I think, so this is something that came up honestly in the last week that I've reflected on is power and dominance will never heal us. It just increases your appetite. Mm. And I think one of the untruths, the lies that we tell is that what can protect you is power, right? And it won't. And one of the things that's really interesting, I think we need to. There are four things that I always think are present in the room: trauma, fear, power, and autobiographies, your lived experience. And I see it present in all of the restorative processes I'm a part of. I'm sure there are many other things in the room, but every time I see those four, the interesting thing about power is it's the one that I think remains critically unexamined. And though I think you could argue a few of those things, depending on who you are, remain critically unexamined. And so I think first, we need to ground in the truth that the tools that we've relied on in that we've been conditioned into believing will keep us safe, that will keep us in balance, won't. That's really important. And I think I've also noticed in terms of, I love that you brought up the question of like, share with someone who would like to heal, like, what is the path? What is a pathway? What's been your pathway? And I think, my mind automatically goes towards the people that, and I've seen this a lot in restorative processes, that don't realize that what you have to offer is what they need. I see that a lot. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of a particular process where it was a situation in which both people had caused each other harm, and one person in particular was like, I don't need this, I'm good. And I was like, okay, okay. Okay, I believe you. And so then we start the circle process. And that person and the process, we did a couple of circles, 6, and became the most talkative person in the group.
It's like famous last words, like, oh, I'm fine, I'm good. You're the one that needs the deeper work.
Yes. And that's exactly what it was. And, ended up uncovering so many parts of their own story that they didn't realize was impacting the way that that they were showing up, right? And by the end of the process, we're like, I want to come back for more. Can we continue this? And so I think there are the people that want to heal. There are the people that don't realize that that healing has something to offer that they need. I think they're the people that don't have the tools, and then there are people who have the tools but aren't necessarily using them for healing and inner transformation and accountability, right? And I think accountability, empathy without accountability will always equal harm. So really what comes to mind with your question is, how do we realize that healing has something to offer all of us? And I think, in my own journey, it was this, sense for me of having tried everything, like this deep grief and frustration around having tried everything. And I'll say my primary way of addressing my own pain, heartache, and trauma was achieving, period. Like, I'm like, okay, I'm devastated. I'm heartbroken. I'm grief stricken. There's so much to process here. So I'm just going to win. That was really my thing. And so up until, I went to law school, I was just like, okay, winning will save me. And I'll never forget, I'd worked in undergrad for this award. It was a national scholarship, and ended up getting it. And I remember in the moment feeling so great. And then by the next day feeling like, okay, this is it. Like, I'm not fixed, whatever that means. Like, I really thought that would do it. Yeah. But still there was like, I can't give up on this strategy. And maybe I just need to get the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And it honestly wasn't until I was in law school where I was like, I'm done getting the next thing. Like, let's retire this strategy. And like, we've tried. And what I'm seeking isn't going to be cured or addressed or solved by some kind of external validation. It's something deeper. So I think first, getting to the point where you're willing to say that the strategy you've been using isn't garnering the results that you actually want. I'm not talking about the results that, make you look good on Instagram and LinkedIn, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Or that you get to, bring home to your friends and your parents and say, look, I did it. I'm talking about when you are, and for me, it was me in my dorm room, by myself and having to see myself and still feeling deeply unhappy, right? So I think one, acknowledging that piece. Two, I don't think that healing is a linear journey. I think it's, and for each individual, similar to when we were talking about survivors, I think each individual needs something different. So for me, in my healing journey, there have been various modalities that I've used to try to get me closer to that person that I wanted to be. And whether it's therapy, that's been a huge tool and resource on my healing journey. Whether it's meditation and mindfulness, so I meditate every day, and it's been so powerful for me as someone who struggles with anxiety, always has. And So having a mindfulness practice has been really powerful. Also, I'd say a community of support that actually aligns with your values. That's the values piece is so key to me because I look back and, you know, man, I think in that search for connection and community, I found early on, was in community with folks that were actually keeping me in place. Um, and but it was fun. So it was really fun. And so I think that's also a piece. And now I'm curious, Raf and Danielle, like what has it been for you on your healing journey?
Yeah, I mean, so much is coming up, so I appreciate you sharing. One of the things that is really speaking to me is the internal carceral state that you talked about. So I'm going to answer your healing journey question in a moment, but it's been sort of something that I think so many people that I work with as a therapist, I can sort of see that coming up when people want to punish themselves for something. Right? And so it's like, oh, well, there's a certain level of guilt that I feel having, all this societal like norms saying I did something wrong in this situation. And so it's like, well, I deserve this. And like we call it like the internal critic, but I can also see where you're saying like that, like the whole institution of like carceral state, right? Like, and so that mindset of I have to punish myself for something. Right. And so I can really connect to that. I think that the other thing that was coming up for me when you were talking was that I will often see people in their journey think about however they've been coping. And a lot of our students are achievers, but that's a positive coping strategy because it isn't, necessarily harming you, but it also is a defense mechanism. You're not processing all of the things that you need to process. You're avoiding, right? And some people avoid with substances. Some people avoid with sex. Some people avoid with a whole host of things that are not healthy for them. Like we think that like achievement is something, oh, well, at least that's positive. It's also not you addressing the healing that needs to be done, right? And so it's still not the best for you. And I like to tell the clients that I work with, it served you up into this point. Let's don't like punish yourself for having used that. Mm-hmm. Let's like rethink how we're thinking about it and not punishing ourselves internally and say, okay, it's worked for me up to this point. What else can I add into that? So that way I can start to heal and start to shift the way I'm thinking and feeling and responding. So I think a lot of that comes up in my own healing journey as well, really sort of accepting who I am and that like I don't deserve to be punishing myself constantly for like I make mistakes. I try really very hard to be accountable and I want to see, hear, and understand others. And sometimes that comes off wrong. I was talking to you the other day and we were talking about the fact that I had to call a dear loved one. I think I called them out instead of calling them in.
It's okay.
But no, I mean, I think that because I felt really safe in that relationship. I thought I could just say the thing, and I called someone very close in my family a racist. I said, oh, that statement is racist. I didn't call them racist, which I thought was a little bit better. But I was like, oh, that's racist, right? And that just completely blew up the relationship. So I think there's also this like fear of like, okay, well, my calling someone out caused them harm, but also the initial harm was there and that never got addressed, right? So I think like there's healing is an ongoing journey that sometimes I get right and sometimes I need to go back and rethink and heal from that because I didn't do it right or didn't do it well. So I think that's all that's sort of been like going on in my brain as you're just like, again, I just want to say amen. Like whenever you're talking,
That's right.
It's like, that was all that was going on in my head.
I'm just thinking about this past week, we had a particularly difficult moment in our university, a bias incident that was, of course, really impactful to our Muslim community. And the pain that I hear, and the desire for accountability is real, and how do we balance our need for safety, which sometimes can manifest with our views as a need for solely punishment. How do we balance that in a way that as institutions and as people in the institutions, we don't send a message that some are valued less than others by not calling folks in and holding them accountable, but also provide an opportunity for learning and for healing, which everyone needs. And it's a difficult moment. So that continues to, as you were sharing that, I was really sitting in the space of those difficult moments where the capacity to see more than one way can be limited because of our pain. So I was thinking about that. And then I was thinking about how someone could have saved me years of lots of stress had I learned early on that winning and achievement was not the holistic strategy. It's difficult coming from growing up poor, and being the first in my family, right? Yes, that was my coping mechanism for a long time, and it does cause you harm in different ways. For me, it might be a little bit less hair, but it does cause you some kind of harm. But I love the framing that you provided, that it's what else. It's only works up to a certain point, and what else are you going to need, because it's not going to sustain you. And I think what really came to a head for me is becoming a dad. That strategy of winning, of accomplishment, I could not sustain in my new reality, and really had to get introspective and thinking about what else am I going to add and what am I going to let go. It also happened at a peculiar time when I joined NYU, a place that is very much about accomplishment and achievement. But thankfully it's happening. Yeah.
I love both of this. Like, oh my gosh, there's so much here. So much here. I think one of her name is Sonia Shah. She's a restorative practitioner. She runs an organization called the HEMSA Collective. She talks about this concept of right size accountability. That's always really resonated with me. This idea that it is not uncommon that when you meet a survivor, someone who survived harm, that they're like, I want that person done. And that's real. And you validate that, right? Like that's a normal experience or response to being harmed, right? And this question of what does right size accountability look like? And knowing that, as you were sharing, Raf, it's not there's no cookie cutter response, right? Because especially, I think, often in complex institutions, there are many needs, right? And survivors, right?
That's right.
And so, in wanting to center the needs of those who've been harmed, like what it's complicated.
That's right.
And so, I saw this really clearly. I was co-facilitating restorative practice training. And, this moment happened where, we get to the guidelines. What do you need in this space to be able to show up authentically? And somehow something as what could be seen as innocuous as cell phones gets brought up. And that gave like someone a real response around, are you trying to police me? And someone then ends up standing up and, in the room and, yelling and about the way in which they feel policed in this situation by someone telling them that they can't have cell phones and all of these different things. And I'm sitting there, one of my values when I facilitate a process up until that point was non-policing and non-domination. So oftentimes when I'm in a process, you get to show up however you are, right? And unless I feel like there is an imminent threat to someone's physical safety, up until that point, I wouldn't step in, right? Unless I think that safety is threatened. And what was interesting was when this happens, the person didn't go towards anyone. I'm on the edge of my seat as a facilitator to see if I have to to step in. The person ends up leaving the room. And, I check in with the group, we take a pause, check in with folks. And ultimately, that person got an emotional clearance by saying what they did. They came back into the space in a completely different energy and we're able to move forward. And so up until that point, I'm like, oh, okay, my values around non-policing and non-domination work. And then as I'm doing follow-up, I spoke to one particular individual that was like, actually, I did feel unsafe. And that shifted everything for me. And why do I share this story? Because knowledge is tentative, right? Like I see, like as a practitioner, like you often, learn about your own practice. Your own practice evolves by those moments where you failed forward. In that moment, one of my, goals as a practitioner every single time is for everyone to feel a sense of safety in my presence. And that was breached. And so now one of my values is pro-safety. And I think about that in the most expansive lens, right? Psychological, emotional, physical, really expansive lens. But that only happened from that person not feeling safe, right? So I think this work, like how do we create space for ourselves to evolve and for us to shift our own practice and to know that like how we responded one time may not work the next time in a different group with a different set of people. And I just also want to say I really appreciated your reflections, Danielle, around the internal carceral state. And I see that as someone who like really wants to be a restorative leader. Like the way that when I do something wrong or what I perceive as wrong or I fail forward, I can be really harsh on myself. And the only reason I've been able to really in the last couple of years curb that is like, I don't want to take that out on my team. Right? So I really appreciate that in this conversation.
Yeah. I'm wondering, because I'm connecting so much with the fail forward, if you have, again, I'm sort of thinking back to like my specific family dynamic, but just some practical tools for how to have difficult conversations or how to like call people in, creating those safe spaces, creating that like way in which you can really sort of hear and understand without having to agree, because I think like we get really stuck sometimes with like, if I listen and if I reflect back, that sort of, means it looks like I'm agreeing with you and I don't have to agree with, like we get kind of stuck in wanting to like win, wanting to like prove our point. Right. So I'm wondering if you, either of you, can share some of that.
A point that I hear often is if I engage in them validating, that gets used often, and you're laughing because it's true. So that's a great question.
Yeah, because I think like we're having to have so many difficult conversations in this time, and I sometimes will avoid because I'm like, oh, I don't have the capacity, like I don't have the, So I'm wondering if you can share just like how we can have some really hard conversations and what we need in order to show up to do that.
Yeah, oh my gosh, so many things. And all of these things come from failing forward so many times. I just failed forward last week, but anyway, some lessons from there too. So I think even before the conversation, there becomes this question of who are you in this relationship? And what I mean by this, so I think, I often share it it came from someone reflecting this back to me of like, I feel, someone was sharing in a training that I was hosting. She was like, I feel like you're one of those people who loves everyone. And I was like, oh yeah. Like I'm equal opportunity when it comes to love. Everyone occupies, a certain space in my heart. And I think that becomes really evident when we're in relationship, right? And the reason I bring that up is because that is someone's first touch point with me, right? It's like, oh, I feel like Krystal's someone who, cares about me, that wants to do things from a place of love. I'm always talking about my values and who I want to be, who I want to become, and opening up space to be called in, right? Like I have values around, loving accountability, loving disagreement. Another one, called radical permission, that anytime someone is in space with me, you have implicit and explicit permission to stand in the most authentic version of yourself. I talk about my values a lot, and hold space for folks to be like, hey, like, today, I'm like, oh yeah, absolutely. And so I share that because I think sometimes when we try to have these conversations where it can feel quite performative when you're saying you want to call someone in, if the relationship, if you've showed up in a way that is rooted in being punitive or shaming someone, right? And now you're saying, I want to try this other approach of like calling in, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we need to ground in like, how have you shown up in that relationship in the past, right? And how do you reflect, that in this space and spaces going forward, right? I'm wanting to show up in these values, right? I think that's really important because I think the performative aspect can really be a barrier. So that's number one. The other piece that I learned in just a conversation last week is giving people a heads up. So I'm someone who's always in the heart space, like all the time. Like if we're not going deep, like I don't want to be there. Like that's my personality. And so I'm like always ready to have these conversations. And I actually learned from someone on my team last week of, I'm wanting to have a conversation that allows us to talk about some really hard things, and they were ready to like get down to business. They had the documents up on the screen, and I'm like, oh no, we got to talk about this other thing. And so I think we need to be mindful of like different people are at different spaces in time, right? And so being called in or having a conversation that requires a sense of like emotional depth and presence is something that people may need a moment for, right? And so number two would be making sure to provide that moment. Give a heads up of like, hey, like today I'm really wanting to be saying to someone, hey, can we have a conversation about this thing we've been holding together tomorrow? Like I'd really like to talk about that. And for us to both show up, in our values tomorrow. Like we really need to provide a sense of like this non-expectation that like someone is where you are in that moment. And some people do need a moment to prepare and ground. So that's number two, give people a heads up. The other thing that I always I'd say are like guidelines and values. And it doesn't have to be this formal thing. It's like, okay, like, what do you need in this conversation to be able to show up, to be able to speak about this honestly and openly? Like, and folks will share that like, okay, like I see this a lot in like workplace conflicts. And I won't do a process with workplace harm or conflict if this isn't present, which I'll say is that I need to know that what I share here won't be used against me outside of this space. That's a common thing of like, I'm going to cross over this vulnerability threshold. And I need to know that like, once I do that, I'm not going to be in the office and I'm going to make fun of you, Raf. You don't do this, and Raf's not going to be like, hey, let's talk about this again. That's right. Right. So what do you need? And then really sitting with like, am I in a space to give you what you need? Right. And like, let's be honest when we're not in that space. There are times that, I'm not in a space to be patient. And I got to really own that, or slow down. Right. And so that may mean that we got to hold this conversation for Friday when I try to block out when I try to not have meetings. Right. And then what are the values that we're going to center in this conversation, or we need to remind ourselves as to show up in a good way. And so one of mine that I have to remember is loving disagreement. And in my household of origin, disagreeing like wasn't, while we held this concept of no throwaways, there was a dominant ideals that we needed to agree with. And I was always like, sort of like on the fringe. But why? And so, how do we normalize disagreement? And I think that's really important as someone who like really values us creating the best discoveries and the best idea. Like they only come through being like, well, I actually don't see it that way, right? And not feeling like you're going to be punished or shamed for not seeing it that way. So I think what are the values you need to ground in? And then going there, talking, naming the rock, if it is a rock, naming the rocks. When things get elevated, which they do, we need to normalize like emotions, people. Like that's also something like
for everybody,
for
yes,
everyone,
yes, for everyone.
Yeah.
For everyone, including, for the person you're talking to, and including the person that may, have power over in that moment. We got to normalize emotions, right? We get to be human. And so when things get elevated, which they will, which they do, being like, hey, I call it a radical intentional pause. That's what I call it. Hey, I think we need to take a radical intentional pause. I'll do sometimes a few deep breaths. I got to ground myself because I can feel it. Knowing like, how does your body react when you're feeling elevated and triggered, right? And I'll take a few moments where I pause, take a few deep breaths, honor what's been said, check in on like, can we continue this conversation or do we need to, do another day? And the last thing I want to share is the other piece is you need to affirm the connection and the relationship, right? So that's, I think, what I think of it as in Florence not too long ago. And I was like, oh, it's like a macaroon. So it starts with affirming the relationship. Then, you talk about the little thing on the inside, and then it ends with affirming the relationship. And in that particular setting, the conversation I had last week, it ended up that I actually had another meeting. And this is a very important point, that you don't let the day close without, affirming the relationship or figuring out when are we going to continue processing. This is really important. It's sort of the same thing like with my partner that like, we don't go to bed at night unless, like we don't go to bed at night angry at each other, right? So sometimes that means we're talking until very late. But this idea that I don't want the day to close without you knowing that I'm still here, that I'm still in this conversation for a lifetime, right? So I'd say that's what comes to mind as strategies that I've used, and it's tentative, right? So, 6 months from now, a year from now, you'll ask me the same question. I'll have a ton of stories of failing boys. Please do this.
I love what I'm hearing. It's also from my like trauma brain, because I work with people who experience trauma all the time, as do you, but just thinking of like the trauma-informed nature of everything that you just said, right? You are letting people know in advance that you want to have this conversation. You're giving them, time to prepare and to regulate their emotions before they go in, right? You're normalizing the conflict and you're affirming, you're validating. I'm here. I'm in this relationship. What we discuss here, is, I'm going to say oatmeal cream pie is probably my favorite. So macaroon. So it's the cream and that like oatmeal cream pie. So yeah, I love the way that you framed how to have that conversation, because I think so much of what I'm experiencing that's really activating for me lately is people being on extreme ends of a belief and not being willing to come together and have conversation. It's really just, hey, we're not going to talk. We can't have these conversations because I believe this and you believe this, and there's nothing that we can, say or do to bring us together, to bridge us. And that just really upsets me, because I'm like, we need to be talking, we need to be engaging, and that just means so much disconnection in the world. And so people go to places where they shouldn't be connecting, places that I think can be really harmful. So I really loved the way you sort of pulled that together. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's all through, these, how do we treat every moment as a moment of practice? I remember early on my restorative practitioner journey, I'm like, I need to find a community of practice. Like, I got to find other practitioners to share and practice with. And then there was this moment where I'm like, oh, shoot, life is a community of practice.
Yes.
Yeah. Because, and a part of it comes from, like, I can teach you, myself, Raf, like, we could teach you how to run a circle like pretty quickly, actually, the technical aspects of a circle, right? What I can't teach you to do quickly, because this takes a lifetime of practice, is the interior work required to actually be able to hold this work. So how to show up, compassionately, openly, with non-judgment, to not reduce human beings to good or bad,
That's right.
Like that stuff, you got to be practicing on a day-to-day basis.
Yes.
So how do you allow yourself to be a practitioner in this lifetime of this work? And I see you, Raf, you're going to say, I see it, share it.
It's a practice for a purpose. It's a practice for a purpose, right? And oftentimes we want to perfect before we practice, but it's so antithetical. No, you have to practice. Only through practice are you going to become better and better. Those failing forward moments is when you really learn, oh goodness, I think my challenge as a facilitator is emotional self-regulation, or my need to validate everyone. So that means that I intentionally invalidate some. Those things only happen when you practice. And I think we're often, this as we're training folks, they want to know, well, what happens, or we feel like we need 16 more sessions, and it's the same content, folks. It's the same content.
It reminds me of like learning a language. Like, I don't want to speak it until I know everything, but you just got to go out there and do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
One question that was coming up for me, or maybe not even a question, just a thought to put out there to the two of you, is often I will do various different workshops when it comes to healthy relationships. And one of the things I think that we don't often talk about in our culture is what are our actual values? Because I think where we set our boundaries really relates to our values. And when I ask students in these workshops, or we talk about boundaries, I'm like, oh, well, they really come from a sense of like your values. Do you know what some of your core values are? I'm really surprised at how people, and again, myself included, probably when I was, a bit younger, can't really say what those true values are. So I'm wondering if either of you want to like share a little bit more about like where you have developed and sort of come to your sense of values, and because they evolve, but like how do you formulate those values?
I love this question. I love this because I think we need to talk about values, right? And I think for myself, so I have a living values list in my notes. And I ask myself, who are you at your best, and what values do you embody at your best? And I often, the list is living because it does evolve. And I often recognize the values that I want to grow into, and I want to ground from those failing forward moments. So on this list are things like radical permission, radical accountability, compassion, non-judgment. And I see, I add many of the others from these moments where I'm like, actually, one of the things I really want to grow into is courage. The courage to speak up, to say things, when I feel them, or I notice, talking about the internal carceral state, like all of these things are present in me, like the way in which when I feel triggered, I can immediately reduce someone to the good or the bad, and, heroize or villainize someone, and I'll notice it. So one of my new values has been, two things. What I'm calling centering like radical centering humanity. Like, what does that look like? I love radical because it means root. And it feels radical to even name these things, right? So like, how do I center someone's humanity in every interaction? And the extension of that, which has been a real challenge for me, is, I'd say, humanity centering speech, right? because so often we can monster make like in a minute. And you know, for someone like me, like one of my favorite pastimes is being petty. Like being petty.
It's so therapeutic though sometimes. You know, like it feels good. It feels good. But
so that's not the value I've mastered, but it is something that I'll remind myself of, you know, when I'm like, oh man, like my speech is really not preserving this person's humanity right now. So I think, you know, how do we encourage people to have, you know, their living list of values, and to know what, and so that you can also know like when you're acting out of those values, and when you want to get closer to grounding them. So they've been like a real sense of grounding for me. But I'm curious, Raf, how do values show up in your everyday life?
Well, I love the way you framed it, is that values are evolving and they're aspirational. They're not, we strive to live up to our values and adhere to them. And oftentimes when we're asking folks, particularly myself in my younger days, but also our students, values are often conflated with beliefs. Now, beliefs can be grounded in known values or unknown values, and they also can be grounded in just messaging and unexamined ideas and perceptions of what the world is or who you are, what is right or wrong, but often unexamined. And the difference between values is that its aspirational nature allows us or calls us to show ourselves some grace, knowing that we don't always live up to them, and by extension, show others grace. Beliefs are finite. They seem so concrete, particularly when unexamined, and that engagement you talked about earlier across difference or with folks you don't agree with, it feels existential. Not engage with someone with a different belief feels existential to my belief and therefore my existence. Now, there's a larger body politic at play that has some sense of folks feeling like there's an existential threat. Some of that is very real. But some of the threat is just the threat to my idea. That's not existential. That's growth and learning if your idea is challenged. And at the end of it, you either come out solidified in what you believed or thinking differently. That's learning. The high nature of disagreement being an existential threat means that we're not learning. It also means we're not examining deeper. And if we're not examining deeper, we're not really getting to the core of what our values are. If we're not getting core to understanding what our values are, then we're not showing ourselves grace when we don't meet them or others grace when they can't meet theirs. So this is all interconnected. And I think it requires really what you're talking about is much more depth in examining. I don't have the solution of how we get there.
Come on.
But it's a day-to-day progress of really, absolutely. I mean, it's actually, we do have the solution. It's the work you do every day. By simply just asking someone, what are your values? Plants the seed. Well, maybe I should think more about this because I didn't know what my values were at 20 until I, got asked time and time again and start to expand and say, well, what are my values? And one of my values is progress. Which makes me an optimist because I always think that progress is possible. And I accept, and I'm so, I am thrilled and filled when there's any kind of minimal progress. So it has to be transformative, but just us coming into a room, and if we don't get to the conversation, it's progress. Next time, us sitting in the chair, even though we don't get to talk about the issue, is progress. So everything for me is always thinking about how can we continue to build and make progress.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you both for responding because I feel like sometimes students will ask me, well, I don't know, how do I do this? And so like I have to unpack some of that with them. And so I really appreciate getting some expert advice to share with them because I feel like I do often say like, you have to like do some deeper work. You have to like figure out like what that means to you. And I can't just give you a formula. Like the students like, just tell me what to do and I'll go do it. And I'm like, that's not how this works. I'm sorry. I want an easy answer, but that's, the work of a lifetime. So yeah, but I'm just curious. We were talking before about community. And so I'm wondering, if you can share a little bit more about the ways in which you do connect with your community and the benefits of connecting to your community, because I feel like, again, so much is going on. I feel like some of the things I see with our students and just within my friend groups is that such a disconnection at times, right? Like leaning into COVID and all this online that we were doing at the time. And that's just kind of led over into our lives now that we don't have COVID. But also I think it plays into some of what we're talking about in that we don't often feel connected. And so therefore we can state these opinions or beliefs without thought of how that's going to harm others. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. My mind's going to so many different places. There is, her name is Auntie Lynette Paglinawan, and is a Native Hawaiian woman, and does Ho'oponopono work, which for them is actually like akin to restorative justice. And I was at an RJ conference 2 years ago, and she was talking about this concept of a healer in every home. And I remember in that moment, and now it has affirmed for me like what my project is in this lifetime. If we had a healer in every home, someone in every home that was able to inculcate these skills and bridge build and hold difference and really ground the importance of healing, we wouldn't need so many of our institutions and systems, right? Oftentimes, to your point of what you were bringing up of like, Danielle, just fix it. Can you just tell me what to do? It comes from this profound sense of, I want something else. I want to be someone else, but I just don't know the way. And so what I'm actually doing is like giving up my power to you. Please just tell me. I think in this work, like oftentimes, like as a practitioner, I feel like I'm being called to be a mirror. And if we were to take the image of, two people stand in the mirror, me standing in back of the person and this person standing in the front, like as a mirror, I'm being asked to like examine with you. I'm not here to fix you. I don't believe people need to be fixed. I don't believe the world needs to be fixed. I believe that we need to be held, accompanied, and walked with. And that's a whole different paradigm, because that paradigm grounds in this sense that actually we have the power and the things that we need within. All we need is a way to access them, right? And so often we're looking to, a person to save us, or an institution to save us, or a system to save us, when actually the question is like, how do you ground in your internal power and become that savior that you're looking for, right? So to the community question, I have this really radical view that like my community is quite broad. It's really broad, and encompasses the healer in every home. And I see that on a regular basis. When I'm, when I'm in conversation with Raf or in a conversation with you, I'm like, you're a part of my community. My community are folks that believe in the values that we're talking about, accountability, compassion, but not only that, but like to transform their inner world that then allows us to transform our outer world. That's my community. I also recognize that while that provides me a sense of belonging and connection, when we speak about community, that's often not what people are talking about, right? You're talking about the people that you feel like you're in direct connection and relationship with. But I know for me, it's been really grounding to broaden that lens and realizing that community for me is more around values. Now, the thing that I also want to reflect back what you said, Raf, that I think is quite profound and reminds me of like when we talk about values, I've yet to be in a process with someone that doesn't have that values are completely antithetical to mine, right? What I mean by that, we'll talk about safety. Like everyone wants them to be safe and their family to be safe. Like they want to live a good life, And so what's so interesting to me is like, oftentimes we can agree on values. It's the tactics we can't agree with.
That's right. That's right.
when we think about that, it's like, actually, most of us actually want the same things. We just have different views on how we get there. Mm-hmm. And so what we're not arguing about is the values. What we're arguing about is the tactics. Right. And so how do we reground and like, you know, we actually both want the same thing and have the same values. So I'm curious, Raf, your thoughts and share more about this.
That reframing is the transformational piece, because I think it brings us more into connection than disconnection, because it gives us an entry point. It allows us to say we're disagreeing on the tactics, but we fundamentally see each other and are trying to achieve the same thing. That is a transformational shift that I think can bring us more into connection, particularly in this moment in time. Yeah.
I just feel like that was beautiful.
It was so beautiful.
Almost like the best place to like
great.
end the conversation. But I could also continue to talk to you, both of you, for the next couple of hours, but I don't want to hold your time. But anything else that you want to bring into the conversation before we end today?
Just deep gratitude. I have so much love and care for both of you and who you are. And this conversation has just really been a gift, really. And just that's what I want to share. And like, I really hope that more people get to have conversations like these, you know, that's what I'm sitting with. So just deep gratitude. Where are you, Raf? Where are you, Danielle?
Well, I was just thinking of the woman who came up to you and said, I'm forgetting now the exact words, but you're just like love incarnate, like you just love people. And I'm just kind of feeling that at this moment that, yes, she was so right. Like that's from the instant I think I met you, and this conversation just sort of shows the world, I think, like just how much like you embody your values and the work. So I just really appreciate the conversation.
Indeed.
Yeah.
We had a speaker here a couple of weeks ago for MLK Week, and I apologize for blanking on her name, but she shared that two things are necessary and always have been necessary to get us through the most difficult times. One is joy, deep joy, not this sort of momentary joy. The other one is community. And I leave this conversation feeling like I'm with my community and I'm experiencing a deep amount of joy. So thank you both.
Yeah.
Thank you. Virtual hug.
Yay.
Virtual hug.
If you have questions about the podcast or anything we talked about today, please feel free to reach out to us at goodsex.podcast@nyu.edu. This email address is monitored during business hours and may take 3 to 4 days for follow-up. We are definitely open to critical and thoughtful feedback, as we didn't cover everything in this episode and might have said something that was inaccurate or that had a negative impact on someone. If you have questions about your sexual health and are an NYU student, you can connect with our Student Health Center sex expert at sexpert@nyu.edu or schedule an appointment through the Student Health Center portal. Look at our show notes for additional information and resources, including organizations, articles, books, and videos.
If you have urgent mental health concerns, safety issues, or you are worried that someone might have caused harm to you, or that you might have caused harm to someone, then you can contact NYU's Confidential Wellness Exchange at 212-443-9999. Chat with them using their mobile app or email them at wellness.exchange@nyu.edu. For anyone, NYU or non-NYU listeners, you can call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673, the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, or the National Mental Health Hotline. Simply dial 988 from anywhere in the U.S.
Thanks for listening, and tune in to our next episode where we continue to talk about good sex at NYU. Subscribe to the podcast to hear all of our quickies and interviews with NYU community members. Thanks to our content contributors for this episode, Bernadette Kerr, Alyssa LaFosse, Dr. Dominic Vaini-Amisa, Zoe Raguzios, and to our health promotion team, Anna Genova, Jenny Mellum, Parade Stone, and Arna Dixit, and to Gotham Studios and Karen Ortman.